Well, hi, it's me again. Back to review for another test. While everybody is signing in, I know I'm a couple minutes early. I wanted to make sure everything was working. You might want to bring up your study guide. Where's my other paper, the study guide? This one. Well, this is a paper copy of the one that's online. I'm hoping that what you did was you took that document online and like downloaded a copy of it so that you could adjust it, make definitions, make notes, things like that. So that's the point of the online one, plus all the links and stuff that I put on there. You might want to have that handy. Also, you might want your notes, your notebook, something to write with. Make sure you have some hydration. Got to keep your brain hydrated. I forgot my straw. What are we up to? 7 people? All right, so I'll say the usual thing. They still haven't fixed the situation where if you use your school account, I don't think you're allowed to comment. You could try it. I haven't tested that out since the last time we did this, which was, I guess, Beowulf. So you can make a comment. If you're unable to make comments on the cuckoo clock, if you're unable to make comments, then you can go ahead and send me comments on email, or you can send me comments. You can tweet them, inbox me, whatever. I'll be monitoring all that stuff during our session. So if you're there, why don't you make a comment so I know that you're there, who's there. Any random weirdos watching our study session. Oh, guess I better turn that off. That's annoying, right? Hi, it's all. Hi, I'm Lisa. We should have a pretty good sized group tonight, I'm thinking, since this is probably the only study session I'm going to do before the exam. I don't think we need more than one. We've been working on it in class and doing reviews together, and you've got your study guide. I feel like it's pretty good preparation. Let me see, what would be a good way to start going through this? I mean, in class I said, do you have any questions about commas? Do you have any questions about root words? Do you have any questions about the short fiction terms? I feel like on the study guide, there's enough info. Hi, Kayla. I feel like there's enough info to help you with commas and root words, but let me just ask, is there something that you want me to do to go over any of the comma topics? It's important that you really, really learn the comma stuff, because this isn't just because I think you need to learn commas once and for all. It's because second semester, I'm going to start taking off points on everything you do if you misuse commas. Yeah, because the only way I have to really make sure that something gets learned is to make it a function of your grades. So your paper might be a 90, but when I take off points for all your comma errors, now it's an 82. So it's important that you understand the commas. So let me start there. Is there anything from the comma list that you would like for me to spend some time on? Just, refresher, another example. You should have notes. If you were absent for the notes, then you can go to the study guide, and I put an image of the notes from that day on there so you can get them into your notebook. And there's also a video and a little like practice online thing for each one. Commas. We can come back to it. I mean, I'm not against coming back to something, but I don't want to just say, what do you want me to talk about? And it's kind of all over the place. We can stay a little bit organized. Hi, Mateo. All right, then root words. I just finished that section of the test right before I went live here. The root words section is going to be, well, let me go back to commas. So I don't know, I said this in class, but I'll just reiterate it, that on the comma portion of the test, you will have a group of 4 sentences. and they'll all be the same except the way the commas are placed in the sentence. One of the sentences will be completely correct for commas. The other ones will have a problem. Either there's supposed to be a comma and there's not, or there's a comma and there shouldn't be, or something like that. And then the fifth option, the A, B, C, D will be 4 versions of the same sentence that have different commas. And then the fifth option, E, will be there is no correct sentence in this grouping. So you have to be able to look at the sentence and figure out, okay, do I have a dependent clause that I need to attach, that needs to be attached to an independent clause, comma? Do I have a compound sentence where I'm putting 2 sentences together and I need a comma and a coordinating conjunction there? Is it a list? And in most of the sentences, there's more than one issue. So I might put like a dependent clause on the beginning and then add it to a main clause that also has commas in a series. Does that make sense? So there could be a mixture of those commas in the sentences that you look at. So that's just what how that one's set up. The root word ones I just finished a little while ago. Those have a sentence with a word that uses one of the roots. I only did 1 sentence per root because I didn't really want to have too many questions on the test. You know, I'm trying to keep an eye on that so that you have time to do the hello to everybody else who's joined recently. If you can't comment, then you can email me or you can tweet, and I will bring your question up. So on the root word section, there'll be a sentence. I'll underline a word that uses the root, and then you just have to choose the answer choice that's most likely meaning for that word. So you'll have the context of the sentence plus your knowledge of the root, because in my mind, that's how you're going to use the roots in your life, right? You're going to be reading something and a word's going to come up that uses omni, and you're going to be able to figure it out real quick because you know what omni means, and with the context of the sentence, you can already know what that word means. So that's my thought on how that works. So I don't really, I mean, unless somebody says something here real quick, I don't feel the need necessarily to go over the root words. I linked each one to a little page where you can get a definition and other words that use that root. That is exactly where I got the words for the test. I went to the study guide literally, and I clicked on the root and I looked for a word that I could think of a sentence for, and I put that word into the sentence and then made up the answer choices. So do I think that you should go and memorize all of the words that are on the list? No. But if you look through there, you'll probably get the same kinds of words that will show up on the test with those roots. So, but if there's anything about roots that you want me to go over, I'm glad to do that. I'll wait for a second, just in case nobody else is saying hi. There's 18 people, but I only see 4 people saying hi. Okay, well, hopefully everybody else knows that they can send questions in other ways. All right, so short fiction terms. Shall we go over those? Let's start with the ones that have to do with plot. So I'm going to kind of segment them out so that we can have a structure to this study session. So it's time for the glasses. You know, I'm getting serious when the glasses go on. So the short fiction terms for plot would be generally, what is a plot? I don't think I'm probably going to put a question like that on the test because that's way too basic. What's an example thesis for reader response perspective? Oh, okay. We'll get to that. Let's do that when I get to the bottom of the short fiction stuff. Remind me, Mateo, I'll get back to that. So plot's going to be exposition, rising action, crisis, climax, falling action, resolution. So you're going to have to not necessarily know the definitions of those things. Well, you'll have to know the definitions, but the way it's tested is you'll have a story, and I'm going to ask you a question like, what happens in the rising action of this story? And you'll have to choose an answer choice that works with that answer. So just remember that you can choose the climax by, I mean, sometimes it's easiest to find the climax and then work backwards toward the rising action and the falling action. So here's the question I would ask myself if I got a new story and I had to figure out the climax. I would ask myself, what is the question that I'm waiting to be answered throughout the piece? Like, as after the exposition during the rising action, what questions is the reader trying to have the answers to? Like, remember how we talked about in Araby, when the rising action is occurring, it's because the boy is looking forward to going to Araby and getting a present for this girl and leaping into his adulthood through that experience, right? But when the question becomes, is he going to be able to get to Araby, and will he be able to get her anything? Basically, those are the two questions. When those two questions are being answered, that's the section that's the climax. Then I can work my way back and say, okay, well, what led up to that? And I can work my way forward and say, what's a consequence of that? Keeping in mind that it's not likely to be the middle of the story. I know that we draw the diagram that way, but usually in modern works, the climax is toward the end and the resolution's kind of short. The falling action's kind of short most of the time. In novels, it's a little different. There could be multiple, climaxes because there's multiple storylines, but we're not reading a novel for the test. All right. Any questions on plot? Other features of plot include foreshadowing and flashback. If that occurs in the story, I will ask that question about that. Different classes have different stories, so I can't be specific about which terms will be on your test. The terms that will be on your test will be dictated by what's present in the story and the poem that I present to you. So just, I think you know what foreshadowing and flashback is. There are lots of different kinds of conflicts. Make sure that you know that an internal conflict is just a person versus self conflict. So don't let that term throw you. Internal conflict just means the protagonist or one of the characters is having an issue in their own mind. Maybe they have to make a decision, or they're trying to deal with something. Could be something psychological. Could be a reaction to a physical conflict, right? An external conflict that happens. So-and-so is mad at me. So-and-so kicked me out of the house. So my internal reactions are what I'm dealing with on the inside as a result of that external conflict. There's person versus person, person versus nature, person versus society, person versus fate. And you just have to read the story to see, and multiple conflicts can exist in a story. So keep that in mind, depending on which story you get. So the climax is where the conflict does or doesn't get solved. Exactly that. That's right, Annalisa. So, the easiest way I can tell you is figure out what question's being asked in the rising action, and then in the section where that's being solved, that's either solved or not solved. You're right. Like in Araby, is he going to get her something? The answer is no, but that's the climax because we find out the answer to that. Yeah. All right. Any conflicts that you want me to talk about? I'm just kind of going through the list. I'm on the left-hand side over here. I printed mine out. You probably have yours online because you're just tech babies. The tech babies. Don't worry, Mateo. I'm going to get to you. Person versus fate. Okay, so person versus fate is when a character wants for one thing to happen and is trying to make something happen, but fate has its way of making what's supposed to happen. So if a character really, really, really wants to get into their dream college and they're doing everything that they can do to get into that college, but fate is sometimes cruel and doesn't allow for that to happen, then maybe destiny takes over, and instead of what the person wants, destiny intervenes. And maybe the person ends up going to a different school because they didn't get into their dream college, and they end up having a fantastic life anyway, because it's possible, right? So person versus fate. What's destined to happen versus what a character wants to happen. I guess there's a little bit of that in Araby, right? If you think about it, he wants to get with this girl, and fate has it that he's not quite, there yet. Kayla, can you give an example of person versus society? So basically, it's something that they don't expect. No, that would be situational irony, but person versus fate means there's an argument or disagreement between the person and fate. The thing that I want is not the thing that I'm destined to have. And so usually those stories end up with the person realizing, that they can't make fate happen. The perfect example is Oedipus, but that's a really long story. Can you give an example of person versus society? Okay, so yeah. Say I live in an environment that is very repressive and women aren't allowed to wear whatever they want out in society and they have to cover everything up, like burqas. And I feel like I should be able to express the person that I am using clothing that isn't immodest. But my society says I have to cover everything except this part right here of my face. Then that would be a person versus society conflict. So whatever is the norm for the civilization, the society, is against the person's views. That's an example. All right. Anything else on conflicts? Let me see if there's any tweets. I don't want to miss any tweets, just in case. It says one, but sometimes it's just telling you that somebody else tweeted. I'm watching, I just can't comment. Rosie, yeah, okay, so you can send me tweets if you have questions. I'm going to go through the study guide, but if you want me to stop and talk about anything, then you can. If you can't comment, then you can. I'm not actually. Okay, so then there's things like epiphany setting, the different types of setting, mood, atmosphere, tone. I went over those in class. I don't know if you want me to go over those again, but I already did that. Irony, there'll probably be at least one question about irony. Arlise, is person versus nature conflict like when the weather or nature is against the person? Yeah, if I have to climb the mountain, but it's snowing and my mule dies and I'm slipping on the ice, then I can't say that's a person versus person conflict or a person versus society. It's because I'm trying to accomplish something against nature. Like, nature's getting in my way. The antagonist is anything that gets in the way of the protagonist. So if it happens to be a snowstorm, then that's person versus nature. Yeah. Okay, points of view. There will definitely be a question no matter what story you have. I'll ask you to identify the point of view that story is told from. So are there any of those that you want me to go over? Everybody's okay with those? We can come back again. I just feel like a structure is good, especially when people are watching the video later if they couldn't tune in or they're watching football or something. Then at least there's like a structure to the video instead of woo, crazy time. All right. What's the difference between third omniscient and omniscient? Nothing. That's the same thing. Third person limited omniscient and third person omniscient are different things. So third person omniscient just means that the narrator can see into the minds of all the characters, read their mind, tell you what they're thinking, how they're reacting to things. Third person limited omniscient means that the narrator can only see into one character's mind about their thoughts and feelings. Because the omniscience is limited to one character. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, I'm going to go to the second column over here on the second page. So that one, after I'm done with that, then we'll go back to Mateo's question because I didn't forget about it. Flashback narrator, characterization, direct characterization, indirect characterization, character development. Okay, so all that starts getting into analysis, right? Characterization, indirect characterization, or things that we do as readers when we're analyzing literature and we're going to write about it. So I probably am not going to ask a question about that unless there's a specific case in the story that you have where there's some direct characterization versus indirect characterization, if that makes sense. Because normally the way that I would test that would be to have you write a characterization, but the essay on this test is the perspectives, not characterization. Anything on that? Protagonist, antagonist, kind of already talked about that. Concrete and abstract antagonist. One of the classes was asking me about that last week, I think on Friday, one of the A classes. So just remember that a concrete antagonist is a thing that is an entity that can be sensed. So it's something physical, it's something you can smell, something you can taste, something you can touch, something that you can see. Like another person or that mountain that we were climbing earlier. An abstract antagonist is present in almost any story that I would give you. So, and there's going to be usually both. So an abstract antagonist is something like fear or doubt or something that is more of an emotion. You can't touch it. You can see evidence of fear, you can see evidence of doubt, but you can't, it's not a tangible thing. So that's an abstract antagonist. When we write about literature and we're teaching kids about it, the first thing we teach them, of course, is concrete antagonists. The idea that, this guy and this guy don't like each other, or they both like the same girl, or there's a fight that they're having. But usually there's also an abstract antagonist that goes along with that. For example, even if there is the concrete argument between two people, there could also be an abstract conflict, an antagonism that makes it so that maybe somebody's self-esteem is an issue. Well, you can't see self-esteem. So it's just a reminder to look deeper into the story instead of just what's on the surface with the concrete antagonists. Okay, I got a couple of questions. Is flashback narrator when the narrator tells the story of like a past event? Yeah, Beowulf's kind of like that at the end. The second half of Beowulf, after he goes back to Denmark, it's all like all of a sudden he went back and he told his king all about what he did, and then it's 50 years later. And then in that little part where they're talking about the king, the dragon and all that stuff happening when Beowulf's already old, there's a lot of flashbacks going back and filling in those 50 years of who died and all that stuff. So also, I think Araby is a flashback narrator, and we have learned is a flashback narrator because the person who's writing it is a first-person narrator, but they're telling about it when they're older, looking back to when they were a kid. So that's the whole story is told in flashback then, right? Michael says, what's the difference between a flashback narrator and a normal narrator? I think I just explained that. Is it just the difference of the time they're narrating? Yeah. So present tense and past tense. Think of it that way. If I'm narrating a story in the present tense, it will sound like it's happening right now because the verbs are all in the present tense. But if I'm writing about something that happened in the past, then I would be using past tense verbs then. And that would be a flashback narrator. Okay. All right. Static, dynamic, flat, round. Any hang-ups there that you want me to talk about? I have to keep my brain lubricated. Somebody told me that half the headaches that we have are because we're dehydrated. I don't know if that's true. Could you explain those, please? Okay, I'm assuming that you mean, Arlise, I'm assuming that you mean static, dynamic, flat, and round. Okay, they're very similar. So, I don't know, in one of the classes I was talking about, the antagonist doesn't always have to be a person, right? No, it doesn't. It could be nature, society, fate, mountains. Okay, so static character. A static character is any character that stays the same throughout the piece. They don't change. They don't have an epiphany or realization. They're not a different type of person in some way at the end than they are at the beginning. More modern stories, they do change. And it's usually that's the lesson that we're supposed to learn. Like The Boy in Araby is a more modern protagonist because he goes through a growth in his understanding about himself through his epiphany. And so he does change. And so he would be a dynamic character. A good example of a static protagonist would be Beowulf. Beowulf doesn't really change much through the course of the piece. He's the same, let's go kill the monster guy at the end as he is at the beginning. And mainly that's because it's a really old text and they hadn't developed, characterization to that point. They just wanted to tell the story of a hero. So if the character stays the same, you can think about it like science, right? Something that's static is not changing or adjusting or moving. Dynamic is the opposite. Dynamic character might not be completely different by the end, but they've gained some sort of insight, some knowledge, some experience. They had a mistake that they learned from, and they developed somehow into a slightly different person. So static and dynamic is about change through the course of the piece. Flat and round isn't about the course of the piece. Flat and round is about depth of the character. So a flat character is superficial, right? Oh, there had to be a waitress that brought the eggs to the table where these two people were having a conversation. So the waitress is just a waitress. She's just bringing eggs. We don't usually spend a long time analyzing flat characters because there's nothing to them. They're just serving a basic purpose in the story. Round characters have depth. So we understand the way they think. We follow along on their thought process, maybe. We try to see what makes them tick, and the author gives us clues about that. So we have information about what makes the person tick. And so that's the kind of character that you want to analyze because there's, stuff being said about them. It's really tough to analyze a flat character because there's like no stuff to analyze. It's like, here's some clay, make a vase. Okay, well, if I don't have any clay, I can't make one, So that's the difference. You can just think about static and dynamic is over time, like if you were charting the character over time through the course of the story, and round versus flat is just how deep does the author make that character. Okay, good. Are we going to be tested on the different archetypes? Yeah, the essay. I'm not going to ask you questions about the various archetypes, if that's what you mean. I'm not going to take up time on the test doing that, but you will have to select an appropriate perspective from which to write your essay. So if, for example, on your essay, I'm going to have you write which perspective you think you're writing from. So if you say I'm going to write from the psychoanalytic perspective, but you don't do that, then that demonstrates a clear misunderstanding of what the psychoanalytical perspective is. So the thing to study for the perspectives is for the essay, and you should be looking at two things. You should be looking at the questions that you need to ask yourself when you're in that perspective, looking at a piece of literature. All of those are from the notes that your classmates did for you. And the other thing you can look at are the sample papers that I put on the study guide. I think I put them toward the bottom, and they're also in one of the weblog entries. So you can look there just like we did for the one about the archetypal approach in Araby. You can look for like the thesis statement, look for what the main paragraphs are doing and see how those play out. So maybe now is a good time to get into Mateo's probably yawning because he asked this question a long time ago. But maybe now is a good time to talk about how you can craft a thesis statement for any one of the 5 literary perspectives. And it's as simple as answer one of the questions. So if the question is, say, in the feminist perspective, if the question that you're focusing on is, what are the gender roles? Are they, gender norms in this story? Then your answer to that question could be your thesis statement for your analysis. So you're not just going to be answering all the questions that are on there. You're going to pick a question that really fits the story and delve into that question. The answer to that question is your thesis statement. Does that make sense? I don't have those right in front of me. Let me see if I can bring them up here on the iPad real quick. Or probably not real quick. I wanted to give you an example, but I don't have the questions right in front of me. You can get into the drive. How long does the essay have to be? That's a good question. I think that you should, I'm trying to make the test so that you'll probably have at least 45 minutes to do the essay. I'm trying to not ask so many questions on the multiple choice that it's impossible to write an essay. I'm not expecting that it's polished. So it can have crossouts, it can have, arrows and add stuff on the side. As long as I can follow it and read it, you're fine. I'm not going to take any points off or think anything about the essay. I'm thinking they'll probably be handwritten, maybe 2 pages, depending on the size of your handwriting, but that's just a guideline. I'm not going to say if it's less than 2 pages, it can't be an A. You know what I mean? Let me go to AP short fiction. Okay, I'm trying to bring up the slideshows with those questions. So an essay that is a half a page is probably not developed well enough. You need to have multiple paragraphs. I need to see that there's a thesis statement in the intro. You need to have body paragraphs that support that thesis. So I would spend a good chunk of time crafting the thesis, like enough minutes to know that it's not too shallow and I'm not going to go anywhere, and it's not too deep that I can't handle it in a couple pages, if that makes sense. I wish that I had better answers for stuff like how long should an essay be, but it just depends on your thesis, complete the thesis. Okay, critical lenses, all right. I'm trying to bring up some of those questions for examples. Okay, so let's just go with new historicism. Oh, I think I hit the wrong button. You know what, let's do reader response, because I think isn't that the one that Mateo asked me to do? Let's see. Let me scroll back and see. Yeah, Mateo asked me reader response, so let's do that one. Besides, reader response, FYI, is your go-to. If you are, what happened? If you are at a loss, like you get test anxiety, you read the story, you're not really sure what approach would be good, reader response works with every piece. So I think that if you study that one, you'll already have like an ace in the hole. So let me spend some time looking at the reader response stuff, questions that are on there for you. Just trying to. Right, I think this will be it. So reader response is just sort of like, how do you interact with this text and what messages does it kind of have for you? Let me see if I can. You can look at the phrase by phrase situation, where you can look at interesting developments in the piece. This is not a good example. I'm trying another one here. Okay, I think this one has one. You can identify a theme and say, this story seems to be teaching the lesson that, and go in that direction. You can connect yourself to the text by saying, how does this relate to people today or issues that we experience? A thesis statement for reader response might be, going with the conclusions that you can draw as a result of the piece, that sort of thing. So you can talk about any of those elements. And in any piece that I might give you, reader response will work. But I'm on purpose choosing stories that, it's really hard to find a story that has all 5 of them really strong. Even when we were looking at Araby, the new historicism was kind of like iffy. I mean, you can look at the time period, but it's questionable how much that has to do with the inner workings of the text. So one of the big choices you're going to have with the essay is, what's the best perspective to use? And that decision-making is kind of part of the question, the test. Because if you choose something and try to make something work that isn't really present in the story, you're going to run out of steam or fall flat. So if that's worrying you, there's some sample essays that you can look at. But reader response works with anything. So to me, that's kind of like plan B. Plan A is, do I see a really strong feminist point? Or do I see a dysfunction in the character that I could talk about? That kind of thing. And then I could do the psychoanalytic. And if not, if I don't see any of that stuff real strong or I'm running out of time, then let me just talk about theme, because that's reader response. Does that make sense? Or pull a few quotes from the story that sort of synergize into an idea, like the light and dark imagery in the story, that kind of thing. So can a thesis say the author uses X, Y, and Z to teach the reader? Yeah, that would be a reader response one. That's one way to go with reader response, because you're talking about what you're gaining from the piece. Michael asks, so how many questions will there roughly be? I'm trying to keep it under 50 and around 45, 40, somewhere in there. There has to be 10 for the root words. There are 7 or 8 for the commas. Most of the questions are made up with the passages. There's a poem and then the story, and then the same story is the one that you'll write about in the essay. What can we expect in the questions for the poem you'll provide for us? Okay, so yeah, moving on to the next part of the study guide. I think this will flip it around, I don't know. The poetry terms. So I tried to pick a poem that hit a lot of these different terms, but not all of them happen in every poem. I mean, not every poem has an octave, a sestet, a couplet, and a quatrain, right? So depending on what poem I give you, I might ask you, is this poem structured in an octave sestet structure, or does it have multiple quatrains with a couplet? So that's the difference between a Shakespearean sonnet and a Petrarchan sonnet, right? So they're all going to be multiple choice questions with the poem. I will define words that I think are difficult for you, because you won't be able to use a dictionary on the test. So if in the poem I think there's a couple of words that are maybe important to understanding the story but might not know, then I'll put a footnote at the bottom. I know that on at least one test I put 3 footnotes, but there's different poems and stories on different tests. That makes sense. So there'll be questions like line 5 contains all of the following except: A, metaphor; B, enjambment; C, and stopped line; D, oh, metaphor's in there twice, I just noticed. D, rhyme, right? E, iambic pentameter. So you go to line 5 and you look and see, are those things there and which thing isn't there, and questions, they're all multiple choice. There will be some interpretive questions with the poem and the story too. It's not just going to be terminology based. Speaker questions: which word best characterizes the speaker of this poem? Because we did work with that. We did that in our written responses. Characterize the speaker of this poem. So A, is the speaker angry? B, sad. I would never say sad. Like focused. C, driven. What's the tone of the voice of the speaker? Okay, since we're on poetry, any other terms that you want me to talk about? Make sure you can tell the difference between an Italian and an English sonnet. I know I did that in class. It's getting repetitious. 8:35. I try not to make these more than an hour, because I don't know anybody who wants to sit and hear me talk for more than an hour. Terminology, allusion. We talked in class about the difference between diction and imagery. Make sure that you can articulate that, especially because you might end up writing it in your essay. And I don't want you to be talking about imagery but mean diction, or vice versa. Rhyme scheme might come up. So make sure that you know how to figure out the rhyme scheme of the poem. A, B, A, B, A, B, B, you know, how to figure that out. That's not too hard. Topic and poetic idea. So the way that I might ask that is after you look at the poem, you can be able to write on it and all that stuff. So if you want to, I wouldn't take too much time doing that because you have a lot to do on the test, but maybe work out topic and poetic idea. I might ask you if you like, what is an appropriate topic for this poem? A, complacency. B, unrequited love. C, depression, and so on. And then the same thing about, poetic idea. So which would be an appropriate poetic idea for this poem? And I'll list them. I have another question. What should the main points be about in the essay? How the author uses figurative language like in a regular analysis essay? Well, yeah, okay. So the main points are going to come from your thesis statement. Your thesis statement is going to come from the questions that you ask. So when you read the story, while you're reading it, you're going to have to answer questions, but in your mind, you'll also be formulating, you know what, this has a really strong feminist overtone. I know that there's some repression happening here, and maybe I can go in that direction for my essay. Your essay, the body of it, whatever you say in that part is going to come from your thesis statement. So start with the question from that perspective that we did from the slides. Answer that question, that's your thesis. And then look at your thesis and say, okay, if this is what I'm trying to prove in my paper, I need to have 2 paragraphs, one that does this and one that does this. I can't say what a good paper would have. I gave you examples of good papers. So you could go and read those. But an example of a bad essay would be if your thesis is super vague. There are some things that happen in this story that are very interesting. Let me tell you about the interesting things that happen in the story. Well, that's like an empty thesis. It also isn't in any of the perspectives. So I should be able to tell from your thesis statement which perspective you're writing about and what the direction of the paper is going to take in terms of which what you're saying about the perspective. So I don't think that you should think about, I'm looking for specific main points. I'm looking for you to say something about the symbolism for an archetypal approach. This kind of character shows up a lot, and here's how it develops in this story, or this kind of plot line shows up a lot. Here's how we see it in this particular story. Or feminist reading, you can see the repression in this female character based on these things. And then prove that, quote from the story, etc. Reader response, here's a theme that, is prevalent in this story, and then explain how the theme is developed. New historicism, I'm going to try, I know at least one of them has a strong new historicism approach, depends on which story you get. But it's tricky because if you don't know the history that's being referenced, then it's going to go over your head. So I'm trying to pick stories when I'm thinking that it could use new historicism that you would be aware of the history that's presented. Like if it references the king of Switzerland in 1727, and you don't get it, this is not a big deal, right? You can always do reader response. But I'm trying to pick stories that have references to common historical things, the Vietnam War or World War II or the rise of Hitler, or, like something that's pretty obvious in, like the Revolutionary War, stuff like that. I know you probably you want something more concrete for that answer, but part of the test is seeing, can you read something and look at it with depth using one of these perspectives. But you have the option of using any of the 5. Please don't mix them. Oh, I should put that on the test. As soon as I'm done here, I'm going to put that on the test. Like, I don't want to read a little blurb about feminism and a little blurb about new historicism and a little blurb about reader response. You're going to pick one and develop it. Does that make sense? I'm definitely going to put, bring a pen. Definitely going to put that on the question. But the question, I mean, you already know what the question is. It's basically write an analysis that uses one of these 5 approaches. And yes, you're going to quote from the story and so on. Okay, new question, poetry. How can I better identify the shift in a poem? Let me go to the email over here just to make sure anybody's sending anything. Okay, so shift usually happens when a poem is moving in time. So the shift can be based on time. The beginning of the poem is, about a person's childhood, and then it moves into adulthood, and there's a big shift. So there can be a shift in time. There can be a shift in rhetoric. So there could be a question and then an answer. Like there could be a shift there. There could be a shift in perspective. First it's one person's perspective, then it's an opposite perspective. There's just so many different ways a poem could shift. You can also look at the structure for shift. So sometimes what happens is a poem has a shift at every stanza sometimes. So you can look for that. I think that most often the shift will be pretty obvious if I'm going to ask you a question about it. Not every poem will have a shift, but most of them do. So if there isn't one, then I'm probably not going to ask a question, or I'll put E, there is no shift in this poem. Which is tricky, I know. I know it's tricky. What can I say? It's tricky, tricky, tricky. All right, any more questions? The rest of the study guide is pretty much those links to those articles. If you look at the articles, they're just examples. So I'm not expecting perfection. I'm not expecting a final draft. I'm expecting a rough draft, a complete essay. Probably 2 pages or so. If it's a little shorter, but you made your point, you got through a conclusion, then you're good. Your intro should include the title of the work and the author and your thesis statement, right? And there should be wording in there that helps me understand which are your reader. I keep saying your reader when you're writing, but I'm mostly your reader, right? Except for those college admissions essays. So I should be able to tell from your intro whether, and you don't have to say, I am going to write this essay from the feminist perspective, but your thesis should use wording that signals to me that which perspective it is. Or you can write a title that says, story title by so-and-so in the feminist perspective, right? So that should be evident in the intro. All right, do you want to go back? Is there anything else? We have a good 15 minutes left if you want it. Anything in commas, root words, terms? Okay. They should have those Snapchat filters on the YouTube. Wouldn't it be fun to make that old lady face and you have to watch me do the study session with my face all squinched up? Okay, YouTube people, try that. Just invented it. Okay, I'm gonna do a countdown then. If there's anything else that you want me to talk about, I'm refreshing the inbox. I'm refreshing the Twitters. Sometimes I get messages on Twitter and I don't even know that they're there for a long time. I don't know why, but I don't see any messages. Nothing's popping up over on the scroll. I feel like we've done a good amount of work and discussion and practice. Everything that I have you do in the semester is purposeful. I'm never giving you stuff just to keep you busy, because then it just keeps me busy grading, and that's like, ugh. So everything we've been working on has been building toward your ability to do this. So if you've been doing well on your assignments, and what we've been doing in class makes sense to you, when we get into groups and we talk about how could we use these different perspectives with Araby, and you get it and you're part of that group and it makes sense to you, then I think you're going to be fine on the test. I know it's easy for me to say don't worry, but I'm not going to put anything on the test that we haven't spent time working on. And now it's just your time to show me just how much you've learned. We've done a lot this semester, and you guys have been working hard. And so I know I probably would have hated this if my teacher said it to me when I was in high school, but this is your moment to demonstrate that you learned. And it's like a glory-filled moment for you. I know you're rolling your eyes. I can feel all the eyes in Weslaco rolling right now. It's okay. It's okay. All right. Anything else before I sign off? I will be at school at 7:30. If you have an emergency question, you can stop by. Some of you don't have your test until Thursday, so this video will be available if you want to review it. You can also stop by. I will study with you. You can bring your notes and stuff after school, and I will sit with you and go over whatever you like a customized study session. Just for you. I'll be there tomorrow after school. I'll be Wednesday before school, after school. I have second lunch, any of those times. So you're welcome. You're welcome. I hope it helps. We have to carve out time wherever we can. And if this helps, then I think it's great. Okay, I'm going to sign off then. I will see you guys tomorrow or Wednesday for the 2B people. And I will see you in class, guys. Oh, we missed you in class today, Linda. I'm glad you could come to the study session tonight. All right, good night, everybody. Study, study, study.